Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us General Robert Spalding. He's been on our show a couple times already. We remember the 100 Days of Joe Biden, which was our most recent one, and also the two books that General Robert Spalding has authored. Um, First of all, how are you doing, Robert? How's it going in Washington?
It's going great. I'm pretty busy working on my company and interested to see how the future goes with everything that's happening.
Great. Well, I think a good starting point for this would be talking about the general results of the US midterms. Now, it was widely covered here in the UK, the results. We saw them get trickle through. Since then, we haven't heard a lot of great detail. The general sort of summary is that Republicans didn't do as well as a lot of people had expected. If you could summarize briefly the sort of results of the midterms, that'd be great.
Well, if you look at the ebb and flow of the political campaigns as they were underway, there was general agreement that the Republicans would take the House and possibly the Senate, but it was less likely that they would take the Senate, but certainly it was believed that they'd take the House. I think over the summer and as we moved into the fall, particularly in the summer, and with the result, the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, I think there was less confidence on behalf of the Republican Party, and then as we got to November, they started gaining in the polls, and I think there was a little bit of what we would call irrational exuberance. So I think overall, the outcome is exactly I think what was contemplated. The Republicans have taken the House. They haven't taken the Senate, but that was never guaranteed from the beginning. I did point to the fact that there's division within the Republican Party around the way it's presented is it's around Trump, but I really think it's around the principles and the policies that the party is going to support going forward. Is it going to be the Republican Party that sat by while the Chinese Communist Party basically raided the company? In fact, a lot of them in the Republican Party profited from it, as have the Democratic Party. Or is it going to be the party that recognizes that these mistakes were made and seeks to rectify it and becomes more a party of the working class? And that division, I think is healthy in any democracy, and I think it's something we don't know how that's going to turn out. And unfortunately, I think it impacts foreign policy and national security policy in a way that doesn't allow us to be very effective with regard to the Chinese Communist Party. So, overall, probably the expected outcome is what we got in the midterms, but I think it's definitely shown division in the Republican Party. That being said, I think there's also division within the Democratic Party. Is it the party of the what I would call the octogenarians, where most of the people that are in leadership positions within the House and even now the presidency are in their late 70s, 80s, or is it going to be a younger group? And then, so it's then you have the age issue in the Democratic Party. The other issue you have is it going to be the extreme left progressives, or is it going to be more the moderate Democrats? So I think there is a war in both parties going on between a moderate Democratic group, or is it going to be progressives? And on the Republican Party, is it going to be kind of the grand old party that was more about letting laissez-faire business practices raid the United States, or is it going to be more focused on national security and our industrial supply chain? These are the things that I think it's not just in the United States that we're going to have these discussions. I think we're having them in democracies all over the world, as we've seen the predatory nature of China and other authoritarian regimes.
There's lots to unpack then. Definitely, it'd be good to talk about China, especially with what's happened to a BBC journalist there currently. It's been very well documented here in the UK, and our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made some comments about China, about them no longer being an ally, and some other sort of comments towards China. Going to the Democrats, we can start there. Here in the UK, we don't often, that there's this sort of either misconception or a reality that we don't often see many moderates that sort of make the news in terms of popular figures or people that we know of. So it's interesting to hear you say that the Democrats have that side to them. Is it something that's growing? Because for a long time, for what we see a lot from AOC, for example, those kind of profiles of people, as opposed to the sort of more middle grounded, your Clintons, those kind of profiles of people. So would you say that's an area the Democrats are doing a bit better in?
Well, I don't know if it's growing, but I do know it exists. I mean, Senator Manchin's a good example of a moderate Democrat that is for instance, energy independence because he comes from West Virginia. I think he recognizes a lot of the same issues that we're seeing in the sort of kind of working class Republican side. So I think what happens is the progressives obviously get a lot more airtime. I think there's affinity, not just from the media, but also from the corporate and financial sector, where you have this sort of mindset that is pervasive across each of those areas. And so they're given extra airtime, they're given extra focus, the policies are promoted, and there's not really, unfortunately, there's not really a lot of mainstream debate on, do these policies actually contribute to the positive momentum of democracy, or are they part of the reason that democracy is on the wane globally? And do they actually lend themselves to the Chinese Communist Party and other authoritarian regimes continuing to gain influence in international institutions, in multinational corporations, in international financial institutions? These are the things that I think are questions in my mind, and probably certainly others.
Talking of sort of the influence of the media and the Chinese Communist Party, we've seen recently on sort of Twitter, and with Elon Musk buying Twitter, I've seen a few sort of Democrats speaking out against that, and some of his stuff on freedom of speech and all of this sort of all that sort of rhetoric and things that he's talking about. How has that response in the US been to Elon Musk buying Twitter? Has that been seen as quite a good thing, a positive thing? I think largely in the UK there's been a good feeling towards pushing towards having people on the platform, like having former President Trump on the platform, him not being censored. I think it's generally been largely positively received. Is that the same for the States? And do you think it's a good move in terms of for democracy in general, having a person like that in charge of Twitter?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is you can compare this favorably to what goes on in China. You've got a single party that runs the country, and that party controls who gets on media. So I think here, if you were one of the ones that were banned from Twitter, then certainly you're going to be happy that those controls are being lifted off of Twitter. Of course, if you're part of the elite that have control over the narrative and control over the media, you're going to be upset because you want to control the narrative, you want to control the media, and you want to silence anybody else that doesn't have your views. I think the question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? Americans, we have a constitution. It's pretty clear that freedom of speech is one of the rights that is part of who we are as a people. Is that going to continue to be the case going forward, or are we going to see one global narrative where if you don't subscribe to that narrative, then you're basically effectively canceled from having any voice on any platform anywhere? when you have consolidation of the media and essentially all these corporations controlling what effectively is a public square, a digital public square, and it says, okay, these people can talk, and these messages can be talked about. If they're countered, or if you disagree with them, then you're not going to have the ability to speak. I mean, this is completely counter to the U.S. Constitution. It's counter to the nation, over its 240 plus years of existence, and I think it's counter to where the right, how people want to live. Unfortunately, after the end of the Cold War, we got out of the habit of fighting for these rights, and really kind of let the corporate sector begin to kind of merge with our totalitarian regimes like China, and begin to create this one global narrative. It's not conspiracy theory. It happens. People are silenced, and they're silenced because they bring up things that those and that are in the elite doesn't want to talk about. They don't want to have their policies questioned. They don't want to have their narratives questioned, and so they just basically say, hey, you can't talk about that. And so it depends on where you are on that. If you're one of the ones that wants to control speech, then you're not happy about Elon Musk. If you're one of the ones that got banned and you want to be able to speak your mind, then you are happy.
I think that's an interesting take on it. I think one of the we recently we've had a few American politicians on our platform, and a number of different people who've talked a lot about the Elon Musk buying Twitter, and I think a really good example that one of my colleagues used was about, I think, the ACLU during the 1930s and 20s, with the who advocated for Adolf Hitler to be heard in the US, for him not to be silenced, so that that they were a group of Jewish lawyers mainly, and they advocated that he should be heard in the US, because then we can prove how crazy and how stupid some of the things he's saying. By almost censoring him, then you may create a divisive environment in the US, and we saw that in the 30s, where there were a lot of Jewish hate crimes happening, and often inspired from Adolf Hitler. So I think for a lot of conservatives here in the UK, we're quite happy to see an Elon Musk figure who being so pro freedom of speech. So it'll be interesting to see if he carries on down this road and really pushes that. What's been
I think there's a difference between allowing people to hear different messages and allowing platforms that are designed specifically to corrode the social fabric of a nation, to be freely capable of being accessed. And here I refer to TikTok. So and there, I think reciprocity is a good standpoint from which to consider this. Facebook, Twitter can't be aired in China, but TikTok can be aired, all over the United States and the free world. Of course, India banned it because of the influence. And I think, when you look at the effect on the young people of something like TikTok, then you have to consider whether or not this idea that, hey, we should just let everything be available, that should be questioned. These tools are designed to erode social fabric, to convince the population that communism is better than democracy, and there's no real counter to it, and it's part of the Chinese Communist Party's methodology for undermining democracy everywhere. And so I understand, this idea of free speech, but I don't think the free speech extends beyond the borders, particularly as it pertains to nation states who have the specific intent of eroding the nation from within. And so these are the things that we have to really consider in the age of the internet, because, quite frankly, There were never during Hitler, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the ability to individually target, influence, and coerce people with apps like that. And so we have to consider that, in the 21st century, the way that we protect the population, certainly political speech within the borders should be wide open. We should be free to counter each other. But when a platform is designed to do the things, to erode social cohesion in the way it is, and even to have foreign influence on platforms that are, say, Western in nature, like Twitter or Facebook, these things ought to be one of the key things from a national security and foreign policy perspective that we look at.
Do you think that's the challenge, is the national security element with a lot of these social media platforms? I really want to go a bit more actually into TikTok, because we had Michael Chertoff who brought up TikTok, and there was we had a lot of people who messaged in saying they still don't quite understand how you're a 17-year-old teenager that's got TikTok and you use it to post videos, short clips. How is that a threat, or how is that, if you like, an issue with the CCP or trying to having that information? There's a lot of people who don't quite understand necessarily the link between, they see TikTok as a very fun platform, a very enjoyable platform. They're not necessarily clued on, or they may have an idea and they may actually accept that it's owned by China, the CCP, but they don't necessarily understand the threat to it. If you could maybe allude to a bit more on that'd be great.
Yeah, there's three areas that we have to be aware of. First of all, when you compare the platform in China to the platform outside of China, in China, they limit the platform to 40 minutes per day per child, and in that, on the platform, the videos that they're allowed to see have to do with science, have to do with patriotic themes. It's mostly about how to become a better citizen, a better person. And the number one, when you survey these kids, the number one goal that they have is to become an astronaut.
Wow.
When you look at the say the U.S. version or the international version, it is hours and hours that kids tend to be on there. It's mostly people doing frivolous things, and the number one goal of the young people that are on that platform is to become a social media influencer. And so, in a sense, ByteDance, which is the AI company behind TikTok, has developed these endorphin releasing algorithms that just keep you glued to the platform. And if you think about it from a societal perspective, if you have your young people watching these things for hours and hours and hours on end, and the platform was designed to get them hooked, addicted, if you will, to those videos, it reduces, eventually it's going to result in reduced productivity of the community. And so that's number one. Number two, the messages that are embedded within those videos outside of China are designed to encourage people that China has a better model for the world, that communism is better for them than democracy. And of course, in China, it's communism is great, and there's no real alternative, and democracy is evil. And so, when you think about it from that aspect, now it's basically trying to convince the world that that China has a better model, and we should all follow China. So we're reducing productivity in the free world by corrupting the minds of the children, and then we're convincing them that communism is better. And then finally, TikTok is a vacuum cleaner for data, and so it enables Chinese Communist Party to accumulate a digital dossier on each and every individual. And in the Chinese Communist Party, as has recently released National Intelligence Council study, says that they're increasingly capable of mining all of this individual personal data for targeting individuals. And we know that the Chinese Communist Party, through the United Front Work Group, begins to cultivate, rising political stars very, very early, so that they can make sure that they have a positive relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And so when you put all these things together, it becomes an enormously powerful tool in shaping the world in the way that China wants the world to be shaped. I flew B-2s. I trained to go to war with the B-2, to drop weapons. There is no comparison to the power of a B-2 and the power of one of these applications that's designed to change the intentions, perceptions, behaviors at an individual level. You could never do that with an aircraft and a bomb. The most you could do, and hope to do, is put pressure on the leadership of a country, but to change the character of a nation, individual by individual, this is a dream if you think about it from a warfare perspective. And so, I think we created this incredible technology in America, the internet, smartphones, and linked it all together to enable these fabulously wealthy companies, trillion-dollar companies like Apple. And it's all around the ability to manipulate your emotions. And it just happens to be great at manipulating your emotions to buy things, but also good in terms of social and political outlooks as well. When you think about it and you say, hey, and as I write about in my book, War Without Rules, the Chinese Communist Party looked at this a long time ago and said, hey, we're going to dominate that space, because if we control that space, then we can control the outlook of people everywhere. And if we control the outlook of people everywhere, if we can control what they think, if we can control what they say, then ultimately we're going to see a system arise that is more friendly to the way that we want to rule the Chinese people. And that's what we've seen. And we saw it accelerate during the coronavirus with the imposition of policies that came from China. So in many ways, as a military member, I look at the strategy and the doctrine employed using these tools, and I say it's incredible in its scope. It's very effective. It works 24/7 every single day, and you can see the impact. You can see it on an individual level, as I talked about, with the surveys and kids, watching Douyin in China and watching TikTok, say in the United States. We just don't. Quite frankly, there's a good book by Christian Brose called Kill Chain, and he talks about the fact that these technologies that came out of Silicon Valley never really made it into the military, and if we could adopt those technologies, we'd become much more efficient on the battlefield, better at killing, better at destroying. But a different way to employ those tools is really to think of war differently and think of it as more of a psychological war and a political war, and use these tools to begin to change the intentions, perceptions, behaviors of people at an individual level. That is the power that Silicon Valley created. Unfortunately, we didn't embrace that or adopt that for war. The Chinese Communist Party did, and they've become experts at it.
How have the Democrats and Republicans responded in terms of, the threats of TikTok seem very apparent. Lots of people are talking about it. How are they responding as parties? Like, do they have a very similar stance on it, or do they have differing approaches?
Well, as you know, the Republican Party has said that they're going to have a committee that's looking at the threat from China. I think President Trump tried to ban TikTok. I think we've gone back and forth. It's not just the parties that are a problem; it's the corporate sector who believes in more of a laissez-faire environment. And I think laissez-faire, when it comes to capabilities that are meant to erode the competitive advantage of a nation, then we have to think differently about those. This is not any different than, say, World War II or the Cold War, where we had to prevent economic activity and financial relationships from happening because there were those that wanted to continue to do business with those regimes. The difference now is that the impact to the civilization is much greater. with constant connectivity and constant access to these platforms. And so, and when I went through and spent my 30-year career in the Air Force, we never talked about these challenges of platforms that could individually target people like TikTok can. That's just not something that we discussed. It wasn't something that we considered. And so there's a whole national security policy making process and a whole national security enterprise and foreign policy enterprise in the United States and other democracies around the world that, quite frankly, are more, I think, up to speed on, say, the challenges of the 20th century than they are the 21st century. And we just haven't made this leap to recognize what's going on in War Without Rules, where I take and break down unrestricted warfare, which is a book that was written by two People's Liberation Army lieutenant colonels, Air Force lieutenant colonels in 1997. They saw the opportunity for globalization and the internet to begin to use these tools to shape behavior. And they created a doctrine around it, a set of principles. And if you look at everything that's happened, since the late 90s, it's just an never-ending process by the Chinese Communist Party to perfect the tools and principles by which they actually go out and execute this. And I think they're demonstrating capabilities that we didn't think were possible. Bill Clinton famously said, controlling the internet is like nailing Jello to the wall. And when you look at how the Chinese Communist Party controls the narrative both within China and outside of China, particularly as it pertains to China itself or the Chinese Communist Party, then you can say, hey, they've quite effectively nailed Jello to the wall. And so that's possible. And I think from the tech companies, we know it's possible because they've used it to become enormously wealthy. Again, trillion-dollar companies. And so we have to recognize that. We have to understand it. And then we have to turn around and say, just like Alexander Hamilton and the framers of the Constitution and the writers of the Federalist Papers in our country's founding looked at social interactions and government systems and tried to come up with something that really ensured that you could have survivable democratic systems, and recognize that this is a threat to that. And then what do we have to do that to protect against that? And it's not in policy, it's actually in technology. How do we ensure data privacy? How do we ensure data sovereignty? How do we ensure that our citizens are free to come up with their own beliefs and are not imperceptibly influenced from an outside power, which reduces your political independence and sovereignty? These are things that universities, scientists, political scientists, because it's involving technology, computer scientists, these are the things that we have to be studying now if we're going to preserve any semblance of the world that existed prior to the invention of, say, the iPhone.
Yeah, again, going to the impact of what they're doing in terms of digital work. Your book does it amazing. I definitely recommend it to all of our listeners. Do you think, looking at the midterms that's just happened, that there was potential influence from the CCP, whether it be softly on TikTok, Twitter, or more directly in terms of the actual election itself? Do you think they played a part in it?
I'm sure that there's no doubt that they did. I think that we don't. I'll just give you an example of something recently that happened, and allow you to consider it. So Elon Musk did a poll, and in the poll he said, "Should we allow President Trump back on the platform?" I think they were getting, like 1 million votes an hour. Ended up with 15 million. I think 15 million people voted in that poll. Now, President Trump is a former president of the United States, and I was having a conversation, on a podcast with somebody from Poland who voted in that poll. So here is a former president of the United States, and there are people from outside of the United States making voting on a poll that's instrumental in deciding whether this former president of the United States is let back on Twitter. And so when you think about it from that perspective, the inability to control or protect, and identify when somebody is a citizen of a country and they're making a statement or making some kind of recommendation, and somebody's from outside, and then you can't determine where that person is from, or if it's even a person, which is one of the contentions that Elon Musk made when he was purchasing Twitter, that there's so many bots on the platform that you have a hard time discerning what's truth and what's not. I think by not having a really understanding the country of origin for an entity on a platform, you create the ability for influence to happen organically. It is part of the system. How influential is that in moving the election in a single congressional district in the United States? I think that that would have to be studied. I think it would have to be studied closely. But I think there's no doubt that when you take the entire environment that Americans are subjected to on a daily basis, to say that there's not anything influencing them in the direction that the Chinese Communist Party sees is most advantageous for them is just being completely naive.
It's funny you mentioned the Trump poll. I remember voting on that on my phone in terms of when you did the poll, if to bring him back or not. What's striking is you mentioned it in your book, in both books, how they seem to have infiltrated both parties in terms of Republicans and Democrats as key figures in both parties. And it leads me to the point, what is the general objective? Now, I know you talk about it a bit in your book, or in quite a lot of detail, actually, but to our listeners, what do you think the general reason behind them infiltrating both parties? The general conception we sometimes read in the UK is almost to create chaos and weaken America, weaken the West. Is that the truth, or do you think there's more to it?
Well, I think that's partially what it is. So first of all, what does the Chinese Communist Party want? They're the sovereign of China. They're, they have their own constitution that says that the People's Republic of China constitution comes second to the Chinese Communist Party constitution. So they're the sovereign. What do they want? What they want, and they say it quite clearly in their constitution, they want to remain in power. They think that that is the way that China should be ruled. It should be ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so what is the biggest threat to them remaining in power? Well, you can look across China today and see the protests. I was just looking at a video on Twitter today where I said this, the Chinese Communist Party is going to seek to blame the protests on the United States. And so, there's this one student, responding, are we being influenced by foreign forces? How can we even get to their websites? They're blocked. So how are we being influenced by these foreign forces? But the Chinese Communist Party narrative is that they are. And so, this is the issue that we have. It's just that I think they recognize the power of the ability to move the population, and the threat is the same threat that a lot of folks in the elites here in the United States say that Elon Musk poses by buying Twitter, is that these voices that really shouldn't be allowed to be heard are going to be allowed to be heard. And so, it is that challenge that I think is a challenge of our time.
Do you think it's a bit different from some of the stuff, Elon wants to do in terms of free speech? Because you could argue with the CCP, it's a bit more in terms of national security threat. Like, would you say it's a slightly different and a bit more scarier than let's say Elon allowing President Trump or whoever he wants to speak on a platform? Do you think it's a bit more almost sinister and darker with the CCP and TikTok and their influence on
Well, I think, I think first of all, one of the things that happened in Iraq during the Iraq War is this effort to remove anonymity from the battlefield. When you don't know who your enemy is, then it makes it very difficult to fight. And so there is something called the Biometric Task Force. There was other things called sexy cells. These were basically used to identify bomb makers by, forensically looking at IEDs and looking for DNA or fingerprints, and then enrolling that in the biometric database that then they could use to find out who was doing these things. When you look at it from, going back to the poll on President Trump, the fact that you have no idea where these people come from that are, having a say in, the public square. Well, and knowing that some of those have the implicit goal to either create division within your society or influence you in ways that are counter to your own interests, then I think that poses a threat to democracy that has to, that can only be, it can only be corrected through transparency. In other words, you're on this platform. We know that this bot person, whatever it is coming from outside our borders, and therefore we need to identify. It's not saying that you have to necessarily silence them, but you should know that, hey, this is not in the case of America, this is not an American citizen, and I should take their whatever they're saying with a grain of salt because they have ulterior motives. Versus if I am having a legitimate debate on policy differences with another American citizen, and the same goes for any other democracy. And so I think that's what I'm talking about, is you have to separate the fact that there are nations out there that want to erode the democratic process within a society, and then those people have to be identified, and those bots have to be identified. If they're not, then they're going to be very successful, because any attempt to thwart speech, I think, is going to come up against the antibodies that were created when our nations were founded. It is, we believe in free speech. And so when you say, hey, we want to silence a group or a person, and then we don't give the caveat, hey, this group or person isn't a citizen here. They are from outside the borders. And not only are they not a citizen, they may be working for a foreign nation that with a design to undermine the society. This is something that, it's the same as if you had invaders, invading on your coast, Marines, coming ashore. What do you say? Oh, well, just come on in and do whatever you want. No, you would repel them. You would defend yourselves. Because this is digital and because it's so new, then we haven't recognized that, hey, the obligation to in the U.S. Constitution, create an army, create a navy, was all based on the fact that there was no internet. Borders were geographic in nature. They were not digital in nature. And, so today we have both geographic borders and we have digital borders. And effectively, we have no digital borders. And so we have this ongoing effort that is very effective, shown to be very effective at moving the hearts and minds of people. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to do something about it. If we don't, then we deserve to have a nation where the principles and values that the nation was founded under are no longer or cease to exist in any kind of meaningful sense. We say we have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech means freedom to say these things and only these things. Freedom of religion. Well, it's freedom to only have this religion and only to worship in this way. And that's what these things are becoming, and they're becoming that because of globalization and the internet and this crossing over of the streams. You bring a totalitarian system into a democratic system that is free and open, and by design, the totalitarian system will seek to mold that that open system to their point of view, which is what they've done so very effectively. We didn't have the internet, when we came up with our constitutional republic, and neither were any of the other democracies formed prior to the 90s. And so we have to expect that the world changes, technology changes, war changes with technology. That's one of the key points of war without rules. Technology takes war in a direction and enables war to move in directions that sometimes are quite shocking and quite dislocating. And it's the obligation of nations to protect themselves and to protect their political independence and sovereignty, protect their culture, protect their the flavor of what the country is. That certainly resulted in me going in and working as a B-2 pilot. It just, being a B-2 pilot is not going to, in my mind, protect the nation today from the threats that the 21st century pose.
Do you think it's that subtlety, and maybe almost in some ways that invisibility, why we don't talk about it as much as we should? Because I can't remember, for example, our current prime minister or previous prime ministers really talk a lot about cybersecurity, digital warfare. I don't know the case for President Biden or President Trump, but it doesn't seem to be talked about that much or in great detail. Do you think it's because of that, how subtle it is, and how, well, maybe not so subtle, but almost how invisible it is, that's why it's often ignored or not talked about enough?
Well, I think that's one of them. I also think that President Eisenhower is quite prescient when he said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." I think the military-industrial complex, in a way, kind of creates this vacuum that sucks in all of the air with regard to what are we talking about and what are we funding in particular. How are resources being spent in national security? And when you say, "Hey, we don't have enough resources for fighter jets or aircraft carriers or submarines," and then you say, "Well, I want to take some of the resources. I want to combat this other thing," and we really don't understand it. It's usually an afterthought, right? It's something that is after we fund all these things over here, these shiny fighters and aircraft carriers and submarines, then maybe if we have anything left over, then we'll look at these other things that we really don't quite understand, and more importantly, they're really hard to contemplate. I think that's what goes on. And so if the government's not funding it, unfortunately, there's not going to be any thought put into it. So the Cold War, for example, there was a lot of thought put into deterrence theory and how nuclear weapons deter war. That led to professors and universities and programs studying the strategy of deterrence. Books were written. There was a lot of deep thought about how do we create a world that deters war because these weapons are so potent. All of that was made possible because of the military-industrial complex and the need to understand the interplay of these weapons. I think what's happened is when you look at it, the things that we're talking about, they're mostly in the realm of the Commerce Department or the Treasury Department. They're not in the realm of the Defense Department and the State Department. And when they do come under the purview of the Department of Defense, and they want to say, "Hey, I need to have some jurisdiction here in order to protect against this," what's going to happen? Well, they're going to come into conflict with the Commerce Department that says, "No, that's just business. That is, we need to let that go. That's the free market." So what? Unfortunately, there's not a free market reason to have a fighter jet. And so you're not having the Commerce Department say, "Hey, DOD, you're monopolizing all the money that's spent on fighter jets. Some of that needs to you need to let that go because we have a commercial use for that." No, it is the Commerce Department doesn't care about fighter jets. The Commerce Department though does care about platforms like TikTok and Twitter. It's the fangs of Facebook, Amazon, Apple companies that grew up out of Silicon Valley and represent 25% of S&P 500. They're a huge money maker, and so the Commerce Department recognizing that. And so when DoD says, "Hey, we need to look at this," well, the Commerce Department says, "No, that's not a national security thing." And by the way, this also works in terms of the supply chain. We need to protect our control over chip production. That was a huge fight, and eventually the Department of Defense and the State Department won over the Commerce Department, but that was not after significant fighting by the Commerce Department and by the corporate sector to say, "Hey, no, DoD, you stay out of this. National security should have nothing to do with our supply chain." Now, think about this from just a common sense perspective: supply chain and national security. Let's take the pharmaceutical industry, insulin, heart medicine, blood pressure medicine, things that people need to survive. Where does most of that come from today? It comes from China. Okay, so a good portion of any population today owes its daily survival to the flow of these products from China. Now, what happens when China cuts those off? Well, we have people that die. And so how does that, how you can, it's not hard, it's not a big leap to say, okay, control of the pharmaceutical supply chain, it gives the ability to influence and coerce our population by denial, right? So it becomes a part of national security. But what the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department will say, "No, that's not national security. That's free trade. That's just business." Adam Smith, Alexander Hamilton, they both understood that when it came to economics, that there was a national security component, and it really had to do with the political independence and sovereignty of a nation. And if you release that, if you relinquish it, if you stop thinking about it in those terms, then you were subject to coercion and influence. That's what's happened in the post-Cold War world, and that's why we've had such a hard time maintaining the positive momentum of democratic systems after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
But even putting on, outside of this, I work in finance, and just putting the finance hat on the commercial side, it just makes perfect sense to diversify your portfolio. You have that much reliance on medicine coming from one country is on a strategic business commercial element is crazy and scary in so many ways, because you're solely relying so much on one country, and if that country for whatever reason doesn't exist in 10 years, 5 years, and you are in a really bad position on a risk element. So it seems really bizarre, that strategy. But going back to the defense point, do you think this should be treated as a lot of the social media stuff, a lot of your Twitters, your TikTok, should that come under the jurisdiction of the DoD? Do you think it should move towards the defense element, or they should at least have the power to say to these things, "No, we're going to override and we're going to now have to investigate and take this a step further"? Do you think that needs to happen?
Well, I think what first needs to happen is just like the Chinese Communist Party came up for a doctrine on how to leverage globalization and internet for their interests. I think we need to come up with a doctrine for what are the principles by which we protect democracies in the face of globalization and the internet. What are these things that we should do, and what are these things that we shouldn't do? And that, once you have a doctrine, then you can start to implement the policies that actually that go along with those principles of protecting your political independence and sovereignty. I don't think we haven't created a doctrine that says, because what you don't want to do is create the opposite effect, which is you become insular and centralized in terms of your control. You don't want to turn the country into a national security state. You want to preserve the character of the nation. You want to have it to continue to be open. So what are these principles? And I think that's the piece where we haven't done the work on. Although we did a lot of work during the first year of the Trump administration thinking about these things, and we put it into the national security strategy, but it needs to be in the fabric of our national security and foreign policy making process. How do you ensure that a foreign power isn't influencing your population in an undue way in the world where we have today with smartphones and the internet? What should you do to ensure that that's not the case? Once you have a set of principles, then you can go about and start making the policies. And the policies have to be made not just in paper, but they have to be made in technology. How do we protect political independence and sovereignty? GDPR is a good example of a policy that was put into paper, but not put into technology. And the way it was put into paper was to say, hey, we're going to fine you if you do something wrong, you private sector company. And then the companies just go ahead and do it anyway. And they say, hey, catch us and fine us, and we'll pay the fine. We're not going to, we're going to comply. But even the way we comply, you're going to be able to take that data and you're going to be able to create intelligence. I can take GDPR safe data today and look at people, and through their smartphone data begin to understand who exactly they are and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. You can do this for just about anybody today using software development kit data. So, okay, so we have this problem. How do we, in technology, how do we build the capability so that people can ensure that their data is only used by those entities, whether the governments or companies, in ways that they agree with, and that they have a vote on, a continuous vote, a vote that doesn't just happen to, that their data goes and it's controlled by anybody else, but they always have a vote. How do you do that? Well, you can do that, by using widespread encryption, but we've never mandated that from a technology standard perspective in a society. That's what I'm talking about. If you can create these principles, and then from those principles create policies, and in those policies create standards in technology, now you can start to get into ways that we can create an open, free system that still allows for all of these benefits that we get from technology, and doesn't allow the government to become too powerful, or corporations to become too powerful, or for a foreign government like China to become powerful over say a democratic system.
I mean, that's a really good point. And do you see, if you like, I think the question would be, how will that come into practice? Who's likely to do something like that on the political spectrum at the moment? Is that something that you could see under a Biden administration making that sort of move, or was it more likely to come from a Republican administration, whether it's a future Trump, Ron DeSantis, whoever the next Republican leader is? Who has a greater, I suppose the question, who has a greater grasp of what's going on and what needs to be done out of the two political parties?
Well, I've seen engagement from a Republican-led Congress, and I've seen engagement from a Democratic-led Congress. In my, just over the last, two, iterations of Congress since I've been out out of government, had a lot of engagement on the Republican side, almost no engagement, zero engagement, in fact, from the Democratic side. So I don't know what the next 2 years will bring. but I'm hopeful that you'll start to see, even more policies, and hopefully principles get developed, policy get made, and changes in standards start to be influenced. So, I think I don't know why. Quite frankly, I don't know why the Democrats aren't as interested in going after the Chinese Communist Party. But my sense is, just in my own interactions, because I don't care what party is there. From my perspective, I want to engage with all of them, because I think protecting our political independence and sovereignty as a nation is far more important than any one political party. I just haven't had the engagement from the Democratic side, although I would love to have it. It just doesn't materialize.
Do you think one of the reasons maybe it's not necessarily a massive vote puller? We talk about here in this country where, although people, I think COVID changed things definitely. We definitely saw a bit more of people wanting to discuss our reliance on China, some of the issues with CCP and all that sort of stuff. I would argue it's almost in some ways starting to diminish again. Do you think it's not a massive vote puller for these major political parties, in the sense of,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's less about the vote, particularly when it comes to China. And it's more about what the donors want, because the donors are primarily influenced by their relationships with China. They're the wealthy ones. They're the ones that have, gotten wealthy with this relationship with China. And so I suspect that on both the Republican and Democratic side, the donors have a lot of influence with regard to China policy. Although, as you've seen in the Republican Party, there's a lot more. There's a different group coming up that are influenced more from a populist perspective, than I would say that the traditional donor class of the Republican Party is.
Great. Well, I know we're strapped for time, so I just want to quickly finish on energy. It's something that we had a few questions on come in terms of its role that it played in these midterms. Obviously, we're seeing massive inflation, not just in America, here in the UK. I want to ask you in a different angle. I think something that you'll have greater knowledge on is the energy to national security element. I actually listened to quite a bit of Mike Baker, he's I think former CIA covert operations officer, and he talked about the need for countries to almost, especially the United States, to seek to achieve energy independence. Whether that's through alternative energy sources or wherever that comes from, it's almost a national security threat by not having your own energy independence. Is that something that you would agree with? And do you think more the Democrats, Republicans should be pushing towards that come for the 2024 elections, and just in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely imperative that we have energy independence. I mean, we've seen the Russians use energy as a tool of influence. I think it's enormously damaging from an inflationary perspective, particularly what we've done here in the United States in cutting production of energy, and cutting our ability to refine, hydrocarbons. So, and it's something that we have to get our hands around. We are not going to be energy independent on just solar and wind anytime in the future. I think we need to continue to pursue nuclear very heavily. But hydrocarbons aren't going to go away anytime soon. And the fact that we want to make them go away prematurely means that we make our population suffer prematurely. And in fact, the Chinese take advantage of this. I mean, they're not stopping the use of hydrocarbons. In fact, they're increasing and building more coal-fired plants every single day. So we have to think about the average person and the impact that these policies make on their lives. We have people that fly in private jets, making policies for people that back them, and their cost of living and therefore their quality of life on a daily basis by these policies. So energy independence is an absolute must. I'm not going to say for the United States or for the UK. I would say for the free world. We need to have an energy supply for the free world that cannot be influenced or coerced.
I think that's a great way to end this episode on. Robert, it's been great having you on as always, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.